morning, everyone, and welcome to the California State Railroad Museum. We're located in Old Sacramento State Historic Park in Sacramento, California. My name is Debbie. I am an educational programming specialist here at the museum. And beside me here are other members of our interpretation and education team. There's Summer and Jake and Rachel. And we are all really excited to be here and present our Halloween sportscast, Tracks to Tombstones. So let me ask you a question. What do you think of when you think of Halloween?
I know when I think of Halloween, I think of getting dressed up with friends and family, going trick-or-treating. It's always great to get extra candy.
And maybe you think of like scary things like witches, monsters, or zombies.
Where do you think the scariest place to be on Halloween is?
Maybe
A cemetery.
Yes, that was pretty good, you guys. We're going to visit the city cemetery, the Sacramento City Historic Cemetery. And we're going to learn about some of the railroad connections that that cemetery has to us.
Yeah, so we talked to Lori. She's the manager over at the Sacramento Historic City Cemetery. And she told us all a bunch of different railroad connections that the people there had. And she said you can come by anytime.
And of course, when we mean visit their graves, the people that are buried in the cemetery.
Because the cemetery is where people are buried who are no longer living.
So we went there a couple weeks ago and recorded our visit there. So hang on here. We're going to run this video of our visit at the cemetery and we'll catch you on the other side. Our first person has to do with a topic that you might be familiar with, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Central Pacific Railroad built the western portion of the railroad, which started right here in Sacramento in 1863 and finished in Promontory in 1869, 6 years later, with the driving of that Golden Spike, which joined together the Union and Pacific Railroads, which built the Transcontinental Railroad that extended all the way across the continent. Now, if you're familiar with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, perhaps you've heard of four men that we call the Big Four. The Big Four were the bosses of the railroad. These were the men who ordered the equipment and supplies, who hired the workers who built the railroad. Anybody remember their names by any chance? Need a little help? They were Leland Stanford, Charles Crocker, C.P. Huntington, and last but not least, Mark Hopkins. So I'm going to test your knowledge here with a riddle to see if perhaps you can guess whose grave I'm standing in front of right now. Are you ready? In the world of railroads, I made my mark, yet lived a life that was quite stark. Frugality was my way of life until I built a mansion for my wife. On Nob Hill in San Francisco, our mansion stood tall. And in this cemetery, my gravesite is the grandest of all. Does anybody have any guesses on who that might be? Well, would you like a hint? The person is one of the Big Four that I just mentioned. Any guesses? Do you think you need a second hint? Okay. Here's your second hint. It's not Leland Stanford. It's not Charles Crocker. It's not C.P. Huntington. So, who do you think our person might be? You are amazing out there. If you guessed Mark Hopkins, you are absolutely right. Mark Hopkins is in the gravesite here that I am standing in front of. So let me tell you a little bit about Mark Hopkins. He was the treasurer of the Central Pacific Railroad. Now, a treasurer of a company or a club or any organization is the person that manages the money, and that's what Mark Hopkins did. And he did it really, really well. In fact, the others really looked up to him, and they called him Uncle Mark because they trusted him so much. Mark Hopkins was the oldest of the Big Four. He wasn't really that much older. The others were in their early 40s, and Mark Hopkins was in his early 50s. But they still respected him and looked up to him and called him Uncle Mark. Now, as the Transcontinental Railroad was built, all four of the Big Four became very, very rich men because after that, they were building more railroads. And they got so rich, they were like billionaires in today's dollars. And Mark Hopkins was married. His wife's name was Mary Hopkins. And they lived together in a very frugal life. Frugal meaning that they didn't spend a lot of money. They lived in a small, modest cottage, actually rented it, in Sacramento. They didn't go on fancy trips. They didn't entertain. In fact, they even had their own vegetable garden. So one day, after 20 years of marriage to this man, who worked very, very hard and earned all that money, Mary Hopkins said to her husband, "Why don't we ever go on trips? Why don't we entertain? I really would love to have a bigger house. Do you think we could do that? I think we could afford it. In fact, we're even growing our own turnips. I think we could have a bigger house." Well, Mark Hopkins loved his wife very much, and so he gave it some thought, and he thought, well, maybe she's right. He knew that Leland Stanford had purchased some property in San Francisco on a hill that overlooks the city of San Francisco called Nob Hill. Actually, in their time, it was called California Hill, but it became called Nob Hill because it was known for rich people. It's kind of not the nicest term for rich people. Over time, all of the Big Four had property up there. So he brought some property that was right next door to where Leland Stanford had bought his property. And he put Mary, his wife, in charge of building a nice, modest house. The thing is, Mary Hopkins had other ideas. She wanted to have a grand house. She wanted a house that had a great big banquet hall, a hall where she could throw grand balls, have a library, have all kinds of things that you might not think about being in a house. It was a palace that she built. But here's the thing. Mark Hopkins died before that house was built. So he never even got a chance to live in this big grand house that his wife built. So that's kind of sad, right? And his wife Mary decided, and he never lived in that house, as I said, Mary Hopkins decided that she was going to build him the biggest, grandest monument in the cemetery. And she certainly did. She ordered granite from the Sierra Nevada, which isn't that far from here, white granite, but she also wanted red granite. And the red granite happened to be all the way over in the Rockies in the state of Wyoming. So they had to bring that in. And it said that here in the cemetery, they had to build railroad tracks to bring the tons and tons of granite to build this mausoleum that you can see behind me here. And that certainly added to the expense. Why would they have to do that? Well, the only other mode of transportation at the time would have been a horse and wagon, and certainly a horse and wagon cannot carry hundreds of tons of granite to build this mausoleum, this monument. So this, in fact, it's the biggest monument in all of the cemetery, and at the time they said it was the biggest or the most expensive house in all of Sacramento. It has 16 chambers in it. That means 16 people can be buried in it. And in case you don't know what a mausoleum is, this is a building where the person is put inside. They don't have to get buried underground like you can see any of the other markers here in the cemetery. So there was room for 16 people. There are 4 people, maybe 3, that are buried here. There's a little bit of a mystery there. But do you think that his wife Mary is buried in there? She is not. When Mark Hopkins died, he made Mary Hopkins the richest woman in the country. She did get remarried, and she is actually buried with her second husband back east, I think in New York. So that's the story of Mark Hopkins, who has the biggest monument in all of the cemetery, which I think is a little ironic. It's a little funny, don't you think, for a man who lived a very frugal life and didn't want to spend a lot of money, for him to be here with the biggest, grandest monument in all of the cemetery. Well, we're going to move on now to another story from, maybe we'll see if you can guess who else we are going to be visiting here in the Sacramento City Historic Cemetery.
Our next story also has a Big Four connection as well. Let's see if you can guess this next riddle. In the Golden State, we made our home. With railroads and art, our legacy is known. Although its stroke did slow my busy stride, with law and culture I took great pride. My wife with generosity grand gave our home and art to this land. Now a museum where beauty's displayed, who are we in history's parade? Well, can you guys guess who this individual is? We'll give you a hint. This individual was a brother of one of the other men that was also involved in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And maybe that's not such a good hint, because all of the members of the Big Four also had brothers, but only one of them had the last name Crocker. So the individual we're going to be talking about in this next story is E.B. or Edward Bryant Crocker. E.B. Crocker was the fifth member of the Big Four, or maybe we should call them the Big Five. Anyway, E.B. Crocker was the brother of Charles Crocker. Charles Crocker is not buried here in this cemetery, but E.B. Crocker, his wife Margaret, and their family are. So we're going to talk about them, their connection to the railroad, and their connection to Sacramento. So E.B. Crocker was a civil engineer and a lawyer. He was also on the California Supreme Court. That's the highest court in California. So he was a really important man. And in 1864, he joined the Central Pacific Company as a lawyer. So he helped handle the legal matters on the railroad. So his job was really long and it was really stressful. In 1868, he purchased a house here in Sacramento on 3rd and O Street. Just a year later, in fact, just a month after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, he had a stroke, in part because of how hard he was working. So his wife Margaret encouraged him to take a vacation. So in August of 1869, the family took a trip to Europe, and they stayed there for 2 years. Because they were such lovers of art, they purchased many different paintings and drawings while they were in Europe over the course of those 2 years. In fact, all of their art filled 4 railroad cars on their way once they made their way back to Sacramento. So what were they going to do with all of this art? Well, they decided to build a museum gallery where they could show off all of their works. And while they were at it, they also added a ballroom, a library, a billiards or game room, a skating rink, and a bowling alley to their massive house. So in 1874, the Crockers opened up the art gallery to the public. And they did this in benefit of the Sacramento Public Library. So over 1,000 different people came to check out the opening of their art gallery and to see all of the paintings and drawings that they had collected. When Judge Crocker passed away in the following year, his wife Margaret decided to donate this art gallery to the city to benefit the city. Because of her generous donation, Sacramentans referred to her as Lady Bountiful because she frequently donated her wealth to help others in need. So today we know that museum as the Crocker Art Museum, and it is one of the most visited art galleries in all of North America. And maybe if you're in this area, you've been able to visit that museum. It's just a few blocks away from here. So in this plot here, E.B. Crocker and his wife Margaret are buried, and also their daughter Amy is buried as well. And their daughter also has a railroad connection as well. So in 1883, when Amy Crocker had married her first husband, they were traveling by rail to Southern California. And in the 1800s, rail travel was really dangerous. It's not computerized or modern like it is today. It was so dependent on manpower that if someone forgot to flip a switch, accidents could happen easily. So in 1883, when they were traveling through the Tehachapi Mountains in Southern California, it was really cold and windy day, and the tracks were really icy. What happened was they were switching the engines, and some of the cars got loose, and they slid down the icy tracks, went around the bend, and went over the canyon. This meant that the sleeper cars, the dining cars, and the mail cars that were filled with passengers all went into the canyon, and they caught fire. So Amy Crocker and her husband and her maid were in one of the sleeper cars that went over the cliff, and they were the only 3 passengers to survive in that car out of the 18 people that were in that specific car. While they tried to save as many people as they could, 21 people still died in this tragic accident. Amy Crocker survived, and she went on to be married 5 other times, and she also traveled all around the world. She died at the age of 77 in 1941. So where are the other members of the Big Four buried? Well, we already saw that Mark Hopkins is buried here, but C.P. Huntington is buried in Bronx, New York. Leland Stanford is buried at Stanford University, the university where he founded. And Charles Crocker is buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. So let's put the Big Four to rest, and we'll move on to the other members that we'll be talking about today.
On Southern Pacific rails, he cooked with care, serving meals beyond compare. From private cars to his own place, in Oak Park he found his space. Governors and politicians came to dine on fried chicken, ham, and steak so fine. Who is the chef with a railroad past, whose culinary fame would forever last?
This person's name was George Dunlap, and you can see his grave marker right there. And he was most famous for owning the Dunlap Dining Room, a restaurant that he opened in March of 1930, right here in Sacramento. George Dunlap's railroad connection is that he worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad as a cook in their dining car in the early 1900s. During that time period, there were only a few jobs that were available for black men in these dining cars, and that included waiter and cook, which George Dunlap was. The railroads offered extensive menus, and George must have learned some skills that he later used to open up different restaurants of his own in Sacramento. He started by opening 2 different restaurants. One was a diner in the California Fairgrounds, and another was a restaurant in the Capitol Hotel. But as I mentioned, the one he's most famous for was the one that he turned his house into. So he started a restaurant inside of his house. Can you imagine that? A restaurant that you're operating that's also your home, and that was the Dunlap Dining Room. The Dunlap Dining Room offered a variety of things, including a soup of the day, some desserts, and then what it was most famous for was the fried chicken, the T-bone steak, and the baked ham. If you lived during this time period and you went to the Dunlap Dining Room, what do you think you would have wanted to order? I probably would have went with the soup of the day. Gives me a little bit more variety each time I go in there. But you can't really go wrong. All of those are wonderful options to enjoy. At the Dunlap Dining Room, everybody was welcome, but there were some very important people that would regularly go there, including California politicians, and even some California governors attended the Dunlap Dining Room. We can only imagine some of the backroom deals and conversations that went on in the Dunlap Dining Room.
Driving a train bound for the pier, with 260 soldiers full of cheer. A switch set wrong, a deadly course. The train went into the bay with mighty force. The engineer pulled the brakes, his final fight, to save the men he gave his life. Who is this hero, brave and bold, whose story of sacrifice is told? When I say the word hero, what does that mean to you? Do you think of a comic book hero like Superman or Batman? Maybe you look to a friend or a family member as your personal hero. Many people look to police officers or firefighters as heroes. Well, the person in this story fits into the third category of hero because his job made him responsible for people's lives. This hero's name is William C. Brown. He was an engineer for the railroad driving a special train from Sacramento to Oakland, California. Aboard the train were 260 men, a part of the 1st Regiment National Guard. They had been at camp for 8 days at the State Fair in Sacramento, and they were returning home to the Bay Area. William C. Brown was responsible for the lives of the people riding his train. Now, as we talked about in a previous story, before computerized trains, human error caused many train accidents in the 19th century, and that may have caused the horrible train accident that happened in this story. As the train approached the Oakland, California station, a track switch was left open, meaning that the train was heading straight into the bay. Engineer Brown saw what was happening, and he tried to quickly apply the brakes to stop the train. But he couldn't stop the train in time, and the engine went straight into the bay. William C. Brown died in this accident, but if he hadn't reacted so quickly, the 260 men that were also aboard the train would have also died. William C. Brown died a hero. Look at his tombstone. If you didn't know that he was an engineer for the railroad, how might you have guessed that he worked for the railroad?
Hi everyone. So we're back at the California State Railroad Museum, and we are in the museum in front of 2 of our exhibits that talk about railroad safety and about the dangers of traveling on the railroad. As we learned about at the cemetery, the railroad could be a really dangerous place, and that's part of what we talk about here at the museum as well. So I'll step out of the way and show you kind of 2 of our exhibits here. We have a tombstone like the one that we saw in the cemetery. It's actually for a different individual than the individual that Summer talked about, but we have their tombstone as well. It's, again, similar story where he died in a train crash as well. So that's something that's really important for us to think about is railroad safety today. In the 1800s, rail travel was really dangerous. And today we encourage you to think about Operation Rail Safety. And if you see train tracks, don't ever stand on the tracks because trains can come so fast at you. And it's really dangerous if you're on the tracks. Trains can't stop. So stay off the tracks. Make sure you pay attention to signage and stay safe out there as well. And then I'll step out of the way and see our other exhibit case here as well. That talks a little bit more about rail safety. Jake will pan it so you can see that as well. So those are just a few of the little exhibits that you'll see here, as well as some of our locomotives and train cars if you come to the California State Railroad Museum.
And that brings us to the end of our program today, Tracks to Tombstones, our Portscast on Halloween. Hope that you enjoyed the visit to the city cemetery. And once again, really want to extend our thanks to Lori and people at the cemetery for allowing us to visit and to record. And they took us around and gave us a tour of the railroad connections that are there. If you're in the Sacramento region and you want to visit, it is open to the public. And I want to make sure I have their website correct here. It's historicalcitycemetery.org. Go online and you can find out more about their hours. So I don't know if we have any questions here that we can answer in the last few minutes. Well, thank you too. A lot of thank yous and happy Halloweens. We hope you have a wonderful, safe Halloween tonight if you're celebrating, and hopefully you'll get a lot of candy. And we hope to see you here at the California State Railroad Museum